So, Irish Stout. This style was formerly called Dry Stout in the previous BJCP guidelines. A lot of styles were renamed when they released the 2015 version, and I'm sure a lot more will get renamed the next time they put out an even newer version. I hope so anyway, because I have issues with a lot of those 2015 style guidelines. Are you listening, BJCP? Probably not. But this change I like. I prefer Irish Stout to Dry Stout. I like naming the beer style after the country that originated it. I mean, Irish Stouts and English Stouts were essentially the same thing for years and years, and they all evolved from London Porters in the first place. But the Irish have really distinguished themselves as brewers of excellent dry stouts over the decades. A lot of that has to do, or had to do anyway, with the types of water they use to brew their beer. I'll get into all that later. Let's start at the beginning. I'm using the BJCP guide as a sort of roadmap, as I always do, to run through characteristics of the style, starting with the overall impression, which is a sort of thesis statement for the upcoming breakdown. It's also the only part I like to read verbatim from the guide. For Irish Stouts, it says, "A black beer with a pronounced roasted flavor, often similar to coffee. The balance can range from fairly even to quite bitter, with the more balanced versions having a little malty sweetness, and the bitter versions being quite dry. Draft versions typically are creamy from a nitro pour, but bottled versions will not have this dispense-derived character. The roasted flavor can be dry and coffee-like to somewhat chocolatey." Fair enough. I found it a little irritating that the word draft was spelled in the British style D-R-A-U-G-H-T rather than D-R-A-F-T. But besides that, I think that was a pretty good overall impression of an Irish Stout. Just because you're writing about a beer from the British Isles, BJCP, doesn't mean you have to spell shit the British way. You're not putting U's in color, so don't put a fucking GH in draft. And now that I said that, let me also say this to head off trouble down the road. I know that Ireland is not in Britain. That's not what I said. Ireland is part of the British Isles, which I believe is purely a geographical term not indicative of nationality in any way. Let's break it down even further. Firstly, you have England. It encompasses the country of England. Nothing else. If you're talking to someone from Wales or Scotland or Ireland, it would be in your best interest to refrain from calling them English, unless you like being told to go fuck yourself. After England, we have Great Britain. This lesson is for my ugly American listeners out there. We tend to not give a shit about other countries, so I thought we might need a little geography lesson real quick. Great Britain is everything on the Big Island. So England again, plus Wales and Scotland. So far so good? Alright. Next is the United Kingdom, the UK. This is the Big Island again, England, Wales, Scotland, but with a little Northern Ireland thrown in for good measure. The UK is a sovereign state, but the nations that make it up are also countries in their own right. Are we confused yet? And lastly, we have the British Isles. This is just the name given to the islands in the Atlantic surrounding the area. It includes Great Britain, Ireland, the Isle of Man, the Isle of Wight, and over 500 other islands. Again, it is a purely geographical term, but the Irish fucking hate it. They do not like being associated with Britain in any way. They are not fucking British. And anything that tries to lump them in with the British is very insulting to them. I don't want to get too wrapped up in the geopolitical mess that is the British Isles. I know, too late, right? I just want to give you a quick breakdown of Ireland vis-a-vis Great Britain vis-a-vis the UK. I really just didn't want anyone thinking I don't know the difference. I do. Let's move on to aroma. The aroma of an Irish Stout is dominated by coffee. It's usually a moderate amount of coffee aroma, and there may also be slight notes of dark chocolate, cocoa, or roasted grains. The level of fruity esters will be medium-low to non-existent. These beers have a clean malt profile. Hop aromas are low to none, but if you get anything from the hops, it will be earthy and floral, like English hops tend to be. But chances are you're not going to get anything from the hops in an Irish Stout. Color-wise, Irish Stouts are black in appearance. They can range from jet black to very dark brown with garnet highlights. Not a huge range of color here. The guidelines have a quote from Guinness here. It says, "Guinness beer may appear black, but it is actually a very dark shade of ruby." Sure. Let's see. These are opaque beers. Not a lot of light is getting through them. They feature a thick, creamy, long-lasting, tan to brown-colored head when served on nitro, but you won't necessarily get that if you drink them from a bottle or a can. That is, unless you drink a can with a little widget in it. Guinness cans have them, as do Murphy Stout cans, Young's Double Chocolate Stout, Boddington's Pub Ale, some others too. It's a little plastic ball that has pressurized nitrogen in it. When you crack the can open, the pressure in the can drops, which causes the nitrogen in the widget to disperse into the beer. It's a handy little trick, and it gives the beer a creamy mouthfeel that you just don't get with CO2. The majority of beers are carbonated with carbon dioxide. Beers on tap use a CO2 tank to force carbonation into the beer when it's poured. Brewers can also add priming sugar to the beer before it's bottled. That way the remaining yeast can eat up the sugar and create CO2 that way too. CO2 is handy because it gives your beverage some texture. It makes your beer feel lighter, drier, and it gives your tongue that pleasant tingling feeling. That's called carbonic bite, and it occurs when a chemical reaction on your tongue turns the CO2 into carbonic acid. Carbonic bite is weird because it's a touch sensation, not a taste thing, even though it's your tongue doing the touching. Nitrogen serves the same purpose as CO2. What makes a nitro beer different is the size of the bubbles. You'll still get the tingles from the carbonic acid because nitro beers are made using a gas blend of 70% nitrogen and 30% CO2, but the nitrogen bubbles are finer and more abundant, which produces a much creamier mouthfeel. It also creates a beautiful cascading effect when the beer is first poured. A lot of stout makers like to use nitrogen instead of CO2 because of this lighter mouthfeel. It can make a stout go down as easy as a brown ale. I personally don't like nitro stouts as much, but they are very popular. I like my stouts to have heft, that weight to them, so nitro is not my favorite, but I get the appeal. And it doesn't affect the flavor, so there's no real harm to it. The flavor of an Irish stout features a roasted grain or malt flavor with a medium to high hop bitterness. They won't have much in the way of other hop flavors, but that bitterness is very important. The finish is typically dry and coffee-like, but there may also be a touch of caramel or malty sweetness. The coffee flavor is the main attraction here. Some versions might also present some bittersweet or unsweetened chocolate character that lasts into the finish. These beers will generally be creamy. They may have a touch of fruitiness, but likely not enough to detect, and they will have a medium hop flavor at best. Hops will not be citrusy or piney, but rather a more typically English hoppiness, earthy and woody. And again, the level of bitterness is somewhat variable, as is the roasted character and the dryness of the finish. The guide here says to allow for interpretation by brewers, which, yeah, that's kind of how all this works. Mouthfeel, like I said a minute ago, has a creamy character, especially if nitrogen is employed. Body is medium light to medium full, low to moderate carbonation. Really, for the amount of hop bitterness and roasty maltiness, Irish stouts are remarkably smooth. These beers, done poorly, could be very harsh and astringent, painfully so. You might get a light astringency from the roasted grains, but they should not be harsh. Harshness is undesirable, obviously. So, historically, when a brewer offered both a stout and a porter, the stout was always the stronger option. This is not necessarily the case these days. Many modern stouts are brewed from a lower original gravity, so what was once a strength designation, as stouts were originally called stout porters, is now just a name, and there are plenty of stouts available that are thinner and weaker than some porters. Guinness Draught, for instance, is a very light stout, whereas the Founder's Porter is a beast of a beer. So, we're going to pick up on the history of Irish stouts in the late 18th century, when porters were at the height of their popularity. Stout was more of a designation of strength than a style all its own. Arthur Guinness signed the lease on the St. James Gate Brewery in 1759, and he was brewing porter by the 1770s. The 1819 invention of Daniel Wheeler's Black Patent Malt revolutionized the way porters were made, and stouts eventually became their own distinct style. By the 1830s, the Guinness Brewery at St. James Gate was the largest brewery in Ireland. Somewhere in the mid-1800s, the Irish Stout and English Stout styles began to diverge. Irish Stouts stuck to the Guinness template largely with a well-attenuated, drier beer. The Stouts of London were sweeter, with less attenuation. By the early 1900s, porter was pretty much washed up, leaving stouts as the dark beer of choice for most pubgoers. And with England making sweet stouts, Ireland was known worldwide as the chief brewer of the dry stout. To this day, though, regional differences exist in Irish stouts. There is the Dublin style and the Cork style. Dublin style stouts are like Guinness. They use roasted barley and they're more bitter and dry. Cork style stouts are sweeter, less bitter, and utilize more specialty malts. That's the main difference in the two styles, but there are other factors at play there too, like the water used for brewing. Historically, the water Guinness used was very soft and non-alkaline, whereas the Murphy's water was hard and alkaline. So there is some variety in Ireland, even if the Irish stout style is fairly rigid. Even the sweeter Cork-style stouts are more dry than your typical English stout. Other innovations helped the Irish stout grow in popularity over the years. Guinness started advertising in 1929. Artist John Gilroy's ads from the 1930s were so innovative that they are still used to promote Guinness products today. The invention of the Guinness draft system in 1959 was how the nitrogenated beer came into play. This new, distinctly creamy stout made the brand even more popular. Then the widget can was invented in 1988, allowing beer drinkers to get that light, creamy Guinness draft taste at home. I know that there are other Irish stouts out there, but Guinness was clearly steering the ship as far as innovation went. That brand is one of the biggest beer brands out there, and the Irish stout is what made all that possible. It's impossible to talk about Irish stout and not spend a lot of time talking about Guinness. But just be aware that there are other Irish stout brewers out there, and they deserve your attention too. Characteristic ingredients in an Irish stout vary a little depending on the brand. Guinness is made using roasted barley, flaked barley, and pale malt, but other brewers don't necessarily use roasted barley. Some of them use chocolate malt, some use other dark specialty malts. Stouts done in the Cork style are perhaps closer to historical London stouts in composition, with a very grist and not dominated by roasted barley. Anyway, that's what the guide says. Either way, regardless of the malt bill, the end result should be a very dark brown to jet black beer. Irish stout is lower in strength than an Irish extra stout, but with similar flavors, and it is darker in color than an English porter. They are not as noticeably hoppy as an American stout, and they're not as sweet as a lot of other styles of stout, such as tropical stout, oatmeal stout, or sweet stout. In the vital statistics department, Irish stout has an IBU range from 25 to 45, which is not as readily apparent thanks to the maltiness of the style. SRM goes from 25 to 40, so from very dark brown to jet black, as I said. And the alcohol ranges from 4% to 4.5%, so a pretty tight range there. If it goes higher, I guess it's an Irish extra stout. The best known example of an Irish stout is, of course, Guinness Draft, but there are lots of other good ones to try. I really like the Murphy's Stout, and I used to drink Beamish all the time, but it's not available in the St. Louis area anymore. If you can get that one, I would give it a shot. I remember really liking it back in the day. I honestly don't think you can get it in America at all anymore. As far as craft examples go, I don't think there are a ton in my area. There's a good one from Public House Brewing out of Rolla, Missouri called Revelation Stout. It's a solid beer. Schlafly used to make an Irish stout around St. Patrick's Day, but I don't know if they still do that one. And Urban Chestnut makes their Kinsale Irish Stout seasonally, but that one might be an extra stout. I think it has a higher ABV than Irish Stout is allowed. There are probably a couple of craft options in your area too. They're a style of beer that is very popular, thanks to Guinness, so it's one that brewers like to make. They sell Irish stouts. That we know. And that's all I have for you. That's all I know about Irish stouts. If you want to learn more about the style, I don't know, read a book or something. We're going to take a break, and we'll see what Thomas has to say on the subject. Surely he'll have some insight. Stick around, and we'll find out together.